Has everyone here been to Bannack? There's a few that haven't? You've got to come to Bannack. Hopefully after you see some of these slides tonight, it'll inspire you to come. Bannack was the site of the first major gold strike. It was the first territorial capital. The history is incredible. The first brick courthouse, the first jail, the first stamp mill. It just goes on and on. So we're going to just give you an overview of Bannack to start out with. Then I'll talk about how the state park was actually created. So we're southwest of Dillon, about 26 miles. That's a map of the park. The park is about 1,600 acres now, so it's really grown over the years from the small inholdings that we had in the town site. And it went from a booming mining town to a ghost town that it is today. They discovered gold there on July 28, 1862. It was a group of prospectors from Colorado, from the Pikes Peak area. That's what they called them, the Pikes Peakers. They were very fortunate to just be stumbling around. They were on their way to Idaho, to the Salmon River mines. They got as far as Old Fort Lemhi. They found they could not get there from where they were at. There were no roads. You couldn't take wagons. It was either by foot or horseback. Fortunately, they met a couple guys that were coming back from the mines, and they told them that all the good ground had been claimed. People were leaving. So a few of them, there were about 200 people, a few of them decided they were going to the Salmon River mines, and by golly, they did. The other people just kind of wandered all over the place. Some of them had heard about the discovery of the Stewart brothers up by Gold Creek, so some of them went off that way, and other ones were just looking at the rocks as they made their way up the rivers and the streams. Back then, you can see the Hotel Meade. This was originally the first brick courthouse in Montana, but when the railroad came through Dillon, the county seat was moved. They had an election. It was very venomous. A lot of accusations of fraud and all. I suppose you don't know anything about that here in Helena. So it was turned into a very fancy hotel. And you can see one of the big gold dredges, the first successful gold dredges to operate in the Western Hemisphere, started at Bannack. There were 5 of them there that operated from 1895 to 1902. This is the Mannheim Brewery. This was the first commercial brewery in Montana. So that's another distinction, another first for Bannack, and they would sometimes give political speeches from the balcony up there as well. What's a decent town without a brewery, huh? 150 years ago, when the first territorial legislature met at Bannack, this was one of the buildings, this adobe, that the legislature met in. There was another log cabin that they used also, but both of those buildings are gone now. But I just thought you might like to see the fancy digs they had back in 1865. Is that what I said? Oh no, it's 1865. Here's a 4th of July parade in the 1860s. They were going all out, right down Main Street. The Bank Exchange Saloon. This was one of the most well-known saloons in Bannack. It was actually where Plummer's skull was displayed on the back bar for a few years until the bar was torched. They believe an arsonist set it on fire in 1898. You'll see some of the people out front, a couple boys, beer kegs. Also, there's a couple ladies hanging out the windows now. Are they employees or are they women of negotiable virtue? We do not know. Of course, mining is what made Bannack happen. If it wasn't for the gold, Bannack would just be part of somebody's ranch today. And this is Gus Graeter. He's on the left with his crew, and they're sluicing for gold. Gus went on to do great things. He was one of the founders of the State Bank and Trust, as well as several other people in Bannack like William Rowe and F.L. Graves. Hydraulic mining, you know, they had a bunch of ditches that came in to provide water. They could move the gravel faster with this. Still, you know, hard work, cold, wet. An early day hard rock mine. This was down just above where Marysville used to exist, and that's just downstream to the east of Bannack, about a half a mile. And you can see people are out there making a big deal about this mine, the ladies in their finery. I don't know what the name of this is, but I did locate this exact site.
And there was a place called Marysville?
Yes, it was first called Centerville, and then it was changed to Marysville in honor of Mary Wadham, supposedly the first white woman in Bannack. Here we have the F.L. Graves electric gold dredge. You'll notice that there's these huge towers to run the electric lines to it. Well, I thought, how would that work? Also, the buckets were a little small. You can see the pipe that comes down from the hillside to the little shack. That had a Pelton wheel in it that provide the electricity. This was in 1895. Well, after a short run, they decided that it wasn't working well, so they reconfigured the dredge. They put larger buckets on it. They did away with the big towers, which would have had to have been a real pain to move all the time. And again, it must be some special event. You see the ladies in their fancy clothes, their stunning hats. That was right there in Bannack, along the creek. Here's the Graeter dredge. It was the next one to be built, and it was quite a bit larger. Again, whenever they would launch one of these, it was a huge deal for the community. Bannack had a lot of boom and bust periods. The first few years were really going strong, and then things would taper off as the easy-to-mine gold was mined out, and the new technology that came about really helped Bannack survive into the 20th century.
So would that have been built on site?
Yes, all of those were built on site. They would have a big part of the creek bottom that they would turn the creek out of. They would build the hull, all the components, the boilers, the winches, the buckets, everything was shipped by rail to the Red Rock siding down by where Clark Canyon Reservoir is, and then by wagon over those rough roads to Bannack, and they would assemble them there, turn the creek into the pond, the dredge would float, and they would dig their way up the stream. This was the last dredge built at Bannack, and this was the Bannack, owned by an English company, and it was the largest dredge. It would use 8 cords of wood a day. Of the 5 dredges, only one was electric powered. The other 4 were wood powered. So you can imagine it kept an army of woodcutters busy to provide wood for these dredges. So there were a lot of people employed by the dredging. But it only lasted from 1895 to 1902. By that time, that exhausted all the dredgeable ground, and the dredges were dismantled and shipped elsewhere if they weren't just left to rot. The Maggie Gibson was shipped over to Alder. They redesigned it, made it larger, and that was the first dredge to start working on Alder Gulch. Here's the Gold Leaf Mill. This was from the 1930s, I believe, or late 20s. This was about a 200-ton per day mill. This was when the hard rock mining really developed. Again, this kept Bannack from dying out. This was during the Depression when the hard rock mining was really booming. Here's one of the general stores, the F.L. Graves. That he was also the person that the electric dredge was named after. Here's the school children from the 1930s. This is Leo Musburger on your left. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Leo. You may have heard of his nephew. He's a sportscaster. But Leo went on from Bannack over to Bonner, and he was a teacher and the principal of the Bonner School over by Missoula for many years. He was quite the guy. And I've met several of these students here, and some of them are really fun to talk to. We've done some oral histories with them. Here we have the Goodrich Hotel. This was the first hotel in Montana. It was also called the Bannack Hotel. And to the left of it, the A.F. Wright General Merchandise. Before it was the merchandise, it was Skinner's Saloon, where the bad boys hung out. And that saloon was built in 1862, and so was the hotel. So those were 2 of the oldest buildings in Bannack. Unfortunately, as things deteriorated after the 30s, this was in the 40s, you can see the shape of these buildings. They were getting pretty rough. Charles Bovey decided that that hotel wasn't doing much good in Bannack, so he dismantled it and moved it to Virginia City. He took the front of the Goodrich Hotel and remodeled the old Anaconda Inn and turned it into the Fairweather Inn. We'd sure like to have it back, but I don't think we're going to get it. You can see some other buildings. On the left is the assay office, and in the center, that was the city drugstore. They're pretty rough by this time. And from the looks of the building on the left, well, it's not there anymore, and you can see why. Things were really deteriorating. So that brings us to the part about how the state park was created. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read some of this just to give you some names and some of the ways that these people, how hard they worked to create this state park. This is the group of members of the Beaverhead County Museum Association that were on the committee to save Bannack, and they ended up buying it. Elfrida Woodside is in the center there. A lot of the information that I have is from the minutes of the Beaverhead County Museum Association, and really the story begins when I went through these minutes back on April 4th, 1940. John Collins and Park Scott were appointed to continue to work to preserve the Bannack jail. It was in really rough shape. You know, the first jail in Montana still stands at Bannack. Of course, World War II started in 1941, December of 41, and all the efforts were focused on the war. So Bannack was pretty much left to just wait until the war was over. In February of 46, Mr. Rush Jordan and the Vice President spoke of the desirability of state parks at Bannack and Beaverhead Rock. Beaverhead Rock eventually became a state park, but not at this time. The next significant mention of Bannack's committee's efforts were recorded on September the 23rd in 1953 when a special meeting was called. At that time, the IB Mining Company, IB Haviland was the major stockholder in that, had suffered some serious setbacks. They weren't making a profit, and they had to sell all their holdings. They owned much of the town of Bannack at this time, and they were going to be auctioned off at a sheriff's auction on the courthouse steps in Silverbow County. I don't know why they didn't do it in Dillon, but it was in Butte. Rush Jordan made the following motion. I move that the Beaverhead County Museum Association make an effort to acquire the interest of the IB Mining Company at Bannack. In carrying out this objective, 2 representatives of the Museum Association should go to Butte on Friday, September 25th at 10 o'clock and bid up to $1,100 on the property. There must have been at least 30 buildings, so prices were very low back then. $1,100 is what they were authorized to bid. So these gentlemen went over to the state bank to request a loan to purchase it and were successful. Elfrida Woodside and Jean Bishop, that's the lady on the right there, went to the sale. However, they weren't successful in winning the bid. The minutes from October 2nd, 1953, Mrs. Woodside and Miss Bishop reported that they went to the Silverbow County Courthouse to the sale at which Judge McClernand presided. Mrs. Ovett was present but did not bid. Chan Stallings Sr. ran the price up to $1,400 after the Museum Association had bid $1,398. They realized that Chan was going to outbid them no matter what they did. So Mrs. Woodside proposed that the group go to Bannack on the afternoon of the 4th and meet with Chan Stallings Jr. He was actually the one that was providing the money in regard to any proposal that they could come up with to try to save Bannack. On October the 7th, the President reported that Chan Stallings Jr. had offered to sell the Bannack property, with the exception of the home of his parents and 2 other pieces of property, to the association for $1,100. He had very generously been willing to substitute 2 other properties for those he had selected so the association could have those which they considered better located for their purposes. This is Chan Jr. He's the one that really had the money. And this is his father, Chan Sr. Chan Sr. was heavily involved in mining. He built the Bannack Mill across the creek from Bannack. As a matter of fact, years ago, when I was a little more adventurous, I went down into the depths of the Hendricks mine, and I saw on a big beam where it had been burnt with a carbide lamp, it said Chan S 35. Well, I knew right away who that was, Chan Stallings. My office is in Chan Stallings' house, the house he used to live in.
So Tom, in the 1950s, were there other people living in Bannack?
People stayed in Bannack until the 1970s. There were a lot of private inholdings still left after the Beaverhead County Museum Association acquired the property from the Stallings. And I think the last private inholding was acquired in 1985. It was a little white cabin down across from the church. Also, Roy Herseth, who was the park manager back then, he sold the house that he owned to the state at the same time.
Do you have any idea what the people living there were doing for a living?
Most of them are retired, not much. There was a little mining going on. Mabel Ovitt, I mentioned her earlier. She was quite the person. She had a little store where she would sell some used stuff and some basics like bread and candy, and some of the people I talked to said she was usually pretty crabby, went around barefoot, and her candy was always stale, but she had her own mine that she would go to, and she actually, unfortunately, died going up to her mine one day. Her vehicle slipped out of gear while she was opening a gate, and it ran over her. She wrote the book Golden Treasure, and she's buried in the new Bannack Cemetery, which still goes back to the 1800s. And on her tombstone, it says, "Our Golden Treasure." Okay, the meetings were held in November and focused on the raising of funds to pay off the loan from State Bank. A financial committee was created, and donations began to come in from throughout the area. Mr. Frank Quinn, a feature writer for Montana newspapers, wrote human interest stories to help spread the word for donations. The largest donation was from Bob Barrett, now associated with the Barrett Minerals down there at Barrett, and that was $82. The Shakespeare Club gave $75. Georgia and Bertie Matthews, longtime Bannack residents, a couple older ladies that never married, gave $25 each. The 4-H Club donated $1. A lot of these people would donate what they had. You know, it might be $1, it might be $5. But back in 1953, this was a lot more money than it is today. During this time, they were communicating with the State Park Division, which was then under the State Highway Commission, about the creation of this park. The commission selected Ashley Roberts, formerly of Dillon and a supporter of the project, as director of state parks. During a finance committee meeting on December 8th, Chairman O.A. Bergeson outlined the progress made on the Bannack project for Mr. Roberts, who was present at the meeting. The handling of Bannack as a state park would depend on adequate appropriations from the legislators for the Parks Division. You know, here we are again. You know, it's all about money. Every time the legislature meets, there's always everybody with their hand out. This I find very interesting. At that time, the Parks Division had about $35,000 for the remainder of the fiscal year and the next. It had 2 sites in the Flathead, 3 sites in the Flathead, 2 at Fort Peck, and another one in Glendive and Three Forks. It had 1 full-time worker in Belgrade who worked on tables and signs and such, and they said he might be able to help at Bannack. So now we're broken into 6 regions, and Region 3, which Bannack is in, has about 13 full-time employees and many seasonal employees. It's hard to imagine such a skeleton crew to try to do so much on so little money. You know, almost 2 years with $35,000. During the meeting of January the 8th in 1954, letters were read from Ashley C. Roberts, State Park Director, regarding the action of the Highway Commission at their meeting of December 16th. The Commission moved and passed to accept the deed from the Beaverhead County Museum Association to the state of Montana of the town site of Bannack, first capital of the territory of Montana, and turn it over to the State Land Board with the recommendation that it be accepted by the state of Montana and set aside as a state park. The Highway Commission was said to be enthusiastic about a dedication ceremony next summer. After discussion with Ross Toole, director of the State Historical Library and Museum, it was suggested it be called a state monument, and it was when it was created. On January the 23rd, a resolution was passed to give the town site of Bannack for use as a public park, historical site, and recreation area to the state of Montana. A condition in said grant will be that the state of Montana shall so maintain and use said properties for the purposes above mentioned, but that should the state fail so to use and maintain said properties or abandon the same, then the title thereto shall revert to this corporation. The fundraising effort had by this time raised $573. They were over halfway there to their $1,100. They were quite busy during 1953. The town site had been purchased from Chan Stallings through a loan from the state bank, and the fundraising was going full steam ahead. On January the 25th, 1954, after 10 years of effort on the part of the association, Mr. O.A. Bergenson and Warren Stone presented the Beaverhead County Museum Association's deed to Bannack, First Territorial Capital of Montana, to the State Land Board in session in Helena. Discussion of the dedication ceremony for the new state park brought out that the association should have charge of the actual ceremony and that other organizations should be called upon to assist with the programming. On July 15th, the matter of repairing the Bannack Church was brought up. At this time, the church wasn't owned by the park. It was owned by the Methodist organization in Great Falls, and they really needed to repair it. The roof leaked like a sieve. The plaster was falling off the walls. There were no stairs. This was after they had fixed it up. But at the last minute, they got permission from the Montana Conference of Methodist Churches, but it was not deeded over until 1956. But they got permission to repair it. They got it just in time for the celebration on July 28th. According to an interview done with Elfrida Woodside in 1981, we wanted to have services at the church, and the church had to be rehabilitated. The state, of course, at that time didn't have the money to do anything about it. The ceiling had caved in and was on the floor, and the debris was at least a foot deep in places. My husband and 6 other men cleaned out that debris and got it presentable for a church. Then one of the boys, who was a carpenter in Dillon and a descendant of a pioneer family in Bannack, got 14 carpenters, including himself, together, and they re-roofed the church in one day because it leaked like a sieve, and then built the steps to the church. I was talking with an old-timer not too long ago that was involved in restoring the church at that time, and he told me something interesting. All the plaster that had come off of the ceiling and the walls, they just pulled up some of the floorboard and just shoveled it all in under the church. So there's a lot of old plaster under the floor of the church now. The dedication of Bannack as a new state monument occurred on August the 15th, 1954, during a 3-day celebration that began on August the 13th. The huge event drew over 5,000 people from across the state and beyond. The governor, J. Hugo Aronson, and numerous state officials were on hand for the dedication. Elfrida Woodside reminisced, Governor Aronson came to the celebration. To do something nice for him, we thought it would be nice to plant a gold nugget in Grasshopper Creek and put him there to pan. Fortunately, the gold nugget was in the sand that he panned. A grand pageant was put on, complete with stagecoaches, pioneers, Indians, and a trial of Plummer and his gang. Music, square dancing, a pancake breakfast, church service, picnics, speeches, all took place at this grand celebration for Montana's newest state monument. Here you see Main Street. We've got the newest car here would be a 1954, and the stagecoach going down the street. Here is Dr. Jim Short, a professor from U of M Western, and he was cooking breakfast. He's garbed up in old costume, but here's what I find interesting. They had to serve a lot of pancakes. Do you notice his pancake batter container? Hopefully it was a new garbage can. It looks pretty new, but he had a big wooden paddle, and they were serving up the hotcakes. This is the improved order of the Red Men. This is where they set up their camp. I had never heard of these folks until I did some research, and they got their start back in colonial days. They were inspired by the people that dressed up as Indians and threw the tea overboard in Boston, and that's how they got their start. They're a fraternal organization, somewhat like the Masons and some of the others. Now you can see it was a pretty steep hillside. Now that's where it is. Look at the cliff that they're at the top of. Let's hope they weren't overdoing it on the firewater, because if they got out in the night to go to the bathroom, they'd have a very abrupt ride down that hillside. You see all the people at the bottom. Now you can't tell very well from here, but we're going to have the ladies' side saddle equestrian team. And you can see them. They're all in old-fashioned clothing. They're mounted side saddle, and they're doing these incredible drills. I mean, how many people can even ride side saddle today? That's another topic that I'd like to research sometime and find out about this group of ladies here. Here they are in a line. Pretty neat looking photo, isn't it? And now we go to today. You know, Bannack is on the National Register of Historic Places, and although dedicated as a state monument in 1954, it's now considered a state park. And that was according to Arnold Olson, the former Parks Division administrator. They decided to rename all the state properties under their jurisdiction to state parks to avoid confusion with the public. And thanks to the hard work and dedication of so many people and the organizations, Bannack was saved and is now one of the best preserved ghost towns in the country. So today, this is what's left as far as the buildings go from this map. That's a picture from the hill to the southwest, very near where the old freight road to Salt Lake went. And then if you'll look on the left side, you'll see that road that goes up the hill. That was the old stage road to Virginia City. I mean, they didn't have, you know, easy grades. They just went the closest way they could get the stagecoach up. Just some steam rising off the buildings in the morning. That White House was one of the very last ones purchased. That was in '85. Of course, here we have Skinner's Saloon, now that it's been restored, as well as the Hotel Meade. And that is not the first jail on the bottom. That's the first jail that was built in 1863. The Masonic Lodge and Schoolhouse from 1874. The Masons built it and donated the downstairs to the town as a schoolhouse. It was interesting when they restored that in the 70s. It was just about to fall over. I had a long conversation with Roy Herseth. Actually, I did a 2-day oral history with him. And he said when they pulled up all the floorboards between the ceiling of the school and the floor of the lodge above, there was about 16 inches of topsoil. They had put dirt in there, and all we can figure out is so that nobody could hear their secret goings-on in the lodge upstairs. They didn't put the dirt back in. And of course, that's the cemetery out by the entrance to the park. There's the church today, Christman store, Ovitt store. I mentioned Mabel Ovitt. That was her store. We have a camping and group use. There's a map of one of the campgrounds. That's our group use area. Another campground. That's the big campground. That's called the Vigilante. The small one is the road agent campground. And here's our new group use shelter. That's about 40 by 60. It's a great venue for having parties. We've had some dances there, weddings. We have costumed interpretation a lot of times. This is John Phillips, our interpretive specialist. Arliss Vanette, our tour guide. Saturday programs. Here we have the fisheries biologist, Jim Olson, with some kids in the creek, and he's electroshocking. These Saturday programs bring out a lot of people. We try to have something for everybody. The kids just love to get in the water and catch fish, and he even dissected them and had a 12-year-old girl cutting the fish open, and she wasn't at all squeamish. She thought that was cool. We had music every other weekend. Here's Bluegrass Gospel Express. They really get the old church rocking. Here's Kate Davis. Of course, I imagine most of you know who Kate Davis is. She's a wonderful interpreter, wonderful lady, a friend of mine. That's Jillian, the great horned owl. She always has a great crowd. We've had as many as 200 people come out for her program. We usually do that every other year. Here's Tom Satterley and Craig Zaspel. We have a stargazing program, if the moon conditions are right, around Labor Day each year in the parking lot after dark. Oh, and here we have Roger Siemens, retired Forest Service Ranger, and his specialty is capturing rattlesnakes from people that build their houses on rattlesnake dens and all. Well, he's not walking around with a live rattlesnake, it's a bull snake, but he does bring live rattlesnakes, and he always puts them out on the ground one at a time. He'll do strike demonstrations. I'll be there to help him wrangle. I've got a set of tongs. He's got a set of tongs. Some of these snakes get pretty excited. It's fun. It brings the people out, as you can see. Any wildlife program, people want to come to. Special events, Bannack Days. That's the biggest special event in state parks. Here's a couple of the people that attended Bannack Days. A lot of people dress up in old-fashioned clothing. Gold panning. People love to gold pan. Here's a gunfight. What would it, an Old West reenactment be without a gunfight? A stage hold-up. I think Governor Edgerton was on that stage. And candle dipping. The kids just love to make their own candles. They can dip the candles in the hot wax. It's a lot of fun. Some of the adults do it too, but it's mainly the children. Ghost walks we have in the fall. This is an unusual photo. I took this at the Ghost Walk, and this is the cast, of course. That's why they look so weird with the makeup and such. But I took 4 photos with a 35 millimeter camera, and they all came out right except for this one. I don't know, did we have a ghost visit us that night? Some of the crowd, before the show start, you're led around by lantern light, and we do a series of skits that are based somewhat loosely on historical events, historical/hysterical. Some of them are serious, some of them are comedic. A couple of the audience members that were getting into it, some of the scenes that we have, some of the bodies of Stinson and Ray, Dutch John Wagner chained up for his last night on earth, chained up to the dead bodies. Dorothy Dunn, a little girl that drowned in the creek, that's supposedly her spirit inhabits the hotel. And here's a cast from another ghost walk. And in the winter can be incredibly cold, but it can be incredibly beautiful. One of the nice things about living in the park is I get the opportunity to take advantage of stuff like this hoarfrost. Here's another shot looking down at the church. I live farther down the street at the east end, but still within the town site itself. The house I live in is probably 120 years old or older. Every other year we do the reenactment of the hanging of Plummer, Stinson, and Ray. We don't do it to glorify hanging, it's just history. We just try to present it as it was written down and let people make up their own minds whether it was right to hang these people. Ice skating. Well, you know how warm it's been? We got to ice skate for 3 days this winter, so it was really a bust for ice skating. But people have fun. They're out on this pond with hockey sticks. Building stabilization, that's always something that's going on, but it's really tough with the budget we have. We need more money all the time. Here, this is the Masonic Lodge, and these are all Masons. They have chipped in all the money for restoration works. They're whitewashing this. They resided it. They put in a new floor upstairs. They're a great bunch of people. They also help fund that shelter that I showed you earlier. The Bannack Association and the Masons funded that. Here's the hotel. They had to put a new porch on. It was unsafe. We don't let people out on the balcony. The rail's about that low, and I can just see somebody going over. Things happen. Broken window all the time. Here's, another shot of them replacing the upstairs. They're working on the carriage house here. I think these were some volunteers from General Electric, retired General Electric employees. They were a great bunch. They did a lot of good work. Here we're working on the cemetery. That's the old cemetery up on the hill. They're leveling out some of the markers, clearing out some of the sagebrush that's taking over things. Here they're daubing the buildings. The daubing, always has to be replaced every few years. Roofing, they're re-roofing the building here. There's a couple campground hosts and their little dog. You can see they like to fish. That's right where their camp spot is, the host site. They've got a really nice site. And we get wildlife, especially along the creek. In that riparian area, in the winter we often see moose. This gal wasn't very shy at all. We saw her a lot one winter. There she is with a calf. Another wildlife. I'm removing one of the ones that a lot of people don't like. We don't kill them, we take them off. I've got a spot on state land. It's about 7 miles away where they have a chance to make it. I don't know if they will, but at least they get a chance. I just put them in a 5-gallon bucket. Well, at this day I had 2 snakes, and it was fun trying to get that second snake in, because as soon as the lid would come off, the other one would come out. These are pygmy rabbits. They're a rare species. I think they're threatened and endangered. They're very small. They look like cottontails are cute, but they're even cuter. The way you can tell the difference between the two, besides the size, is these do not have a white fluffy tail. They have a gray tail. So if you ever wonder, and if you see a white tail, it's a cottontail, not a pygmy rabbit. Again, great horned owls. This was last spring. The owls nested in a big tree right by our visitor center where you enter the park. I mean, it was wonderful. They weren't spooky at all. We got to watch the chicks hatch. There's one of the chicks. Here's one of the school groups. They're all looking at the owls up in the tree. It was just a great thing to have, a wonderful teaching tool. And of course, the sage grouse. There's a lot of sage grouse down there. Some of you may be familiar with Ben Diebel with the Montana Audubon Society. He comes down every year to do his sage grouse research. That's one of the males displaying. There's a really nice lick that's easy to get to up Reservoir Creek. It's about 4 or 5 miles from Bannack. It's one that I've been to quite a few times and taken some of my friends. Of course, you've got to get up early for that. You've got to be there before daylight. This is the sage sparrow, I believe it's called, and we've had a lot of people come down there to find this bird. I wasn't familiar with it, but this is it. Is that right? Anybody familiar with that? Yeah. I was told that it was a sage sparrow. And then this is a flycatcher. And that's another one that people are real interested in. I don't know why. Maybe it's a rare bird. And of course, this brings us to the end. So if you have any questions about Bannack or anything, I'd be happy to entertain them now. Yes?
I